The room smelled like recycled air and old fear. Not the sharp animal fear that came in a flash and passed, but the slow kind, the kind that had been marinating in the walls for months, maybe longer, soaking into the concrete until even the dust carried it. Leonard Vasquez had stopped noticing it weeks ago, or maybe months. Time in the chamber had a way of folding back on itself, like paper creased too many times, until the folds became the only geography that mattered. He was seated at the table when the overseer entered. He was always seated when the overseer entered. Standing was a form of defiance they had stripped from him in the early weeks, along with his boots, his name in their records, and most of the feeling in his left hand, where the restraints had been cinched too tight for too long. He kept his eyes on the table's surface, a gray composite slab, military grade, same material they used for the floors of troop carriers, and he waited. The overseer's footsteps were distinctive. 4 limbs, yes, but the Varath moved on 2 of them when they chose to approximate human comportment, which the overseer did almost obsessively, as though the mimicry itself were a form of dominance. Its gait was wrong in the way that uncanny things are wrong, close enough to human that the deviation registered not as alien, but as broken, a man with something fundamental removed. "You're never happy," the overseer said. It had been since studying English for what Leonard guessed was years before the compact collapsed, and it spoke with a precision that was, in its own way, more unsettling than an accent would have been. No stumble, no hesitation, no warmth. Just the words clean and correct, like a blade wiped after use. "I bring you food. Real food, not the supplement blocks. I bring you music. I allow you windows." Leonard said nothing. "You sit there," the overseer continued, pulling back the chair across from him with a deliberateness that suggested it had watched a great many humans sit down and pull back chairs, and had studied the motion until it could replicate it perfectly, which made it wrong in exactly the same way its walk was wrong. "And you make that face." "What face?" Leonard said. He had not intended to speak. The words arrived before the decision to make them. The overseer tilted its head. The angle was too far, the neck capable of a range of motion that Leonard's vertebrae would not survive. The face that says you are somewhere else, he always was. The somewhere else was a hillside on the eastern edge of the Appalachians. 3 years, and what felt like 3 geological epochs ago, before the Varath ships had come through the atmospheric layer like stones through still water, before the compact and the processing centers and the re-education protocols. There was a woman on that hillside. Her name was Joanna, and she had a laugh that arrived in stages. First a breath, then a sound, then the full thing, unguarded, brilliant, and she had been the last truly unguarded thing Leonard could remember. On that hillside she had turned to him and pointed at something in the middle distance. A hawk riding a thermal, and she had said, "Look," and he had, and the hawk had been magnificent. But he had been looking at her, looking at it, and that had been better. "Vasquez." The overseer's voice carried no particular urgency, it never did. That was the strategy, Leonard had come to understand. No peaks, no valleys. A sustained and featureless pressure, like water wearing rock. "We've discussed this," they had. At length, the overseer had a gift for discussion, in the same way a surgeon had a gift for cutting. It was technical, proficient, not cruel in any way Leonard could have easily articulated, which was the most insidious part. The cruelty was architectural. It was built into the room, into the schedule, into the particular selection of human classical music they piped through the speakers. Always music Leonard could almost but not quite identify, skewed just enough to make the recognition feel like a failure. "Sign the statement," the overseer said, "and the hill is yours." It laid a document on the table. Leonard looked at it without looking at it, the way you could look at a flame without letting it blind you. He knew what it said. He'd read it in pieces across a dozen separate sessions, inferring the whole from the fragments the overseer allowed him to see. It said that he had operated as an agent of the human resistance. It said that he had provided material support to insurgent cells in the northeastern corridor. It said that he had personally transmitted encoded communications to cells in 3 other processing zones, bypassing Varath signal suppression, through a method that the statement would require him to describe in technical detail, so that the Varath could find and close that method, so that the cells would go silent, so that the people in them would be found, so that they would end up in rooms like this one, at tables like this one, with an overseer across from them making the face that wasn't a face. Leonard looked at the document. He thought about the hawk. "No," he said. The overseer was quiet for a moment. In that quiet, somewhere in the walls, the ventilation system cycled, and the music shifted, something stringed and minor key, something that felt like it was reaching for a resolution it would never find. "You are tired," the overseer said at last. "I'm fine. You are not fine. You haven't been fine in a significant period of time. I am not saying this to diminish you. I am saying it because it is accurate." The overseer reached across, and with a precision that was almost gentle, slid the document back toward its side of the table. "Humans," it said, as though beginning a lecture it had given before, "are not built for sustained isolation. This is a documented biological fact. Your species craves stimulus, social contact, the knowledge that you are perceived by others." It paused. "I perceive you. That should count for something." Leonard almost laughed. The almost law surprised him. He'd thought they'd taken that from him somewhere around the 6th week. "Something funny?" the overseer asked. "No," Leonard said. But something in his chest had shifted, very slightly, like a stone rolled an inch from its resting place. The overseer studied him. The Verath's visual organs were arranged differently from a human's. 2 primary, 2 secondary, set at angles that allowed for an almost total field of vision. And when it studied you, you felt it the way you felt a change in air pressure. Complete. Environmental. "You're thinking about the woman," it said. Leonard said nothing. "Joanna Reyes, formerly assigned to Transit Node 7. Current status, don't," Leonard said. "Unknown. Which is not necessarily bad news, Vasquez. Unknown is not the same as dead. I know the difference." "Then you understand why cooperation serves her interests as much as your own." The overseer stood another studied movement, the rise from a chair executed with the kind of deliberateness that comes from having practiced it without a body that remembers how, and moved to the wall where a panel had been set to display a loop of footage. Green hills, actual ones. Somewhere in what had been Ireland, Leonard thought. Filmed from a drone, the grass rippling in a wind the room could not feel. "We want the same thing. Resolution. After resolution you go back. A life that resembles what you had. You want me to help you disappear 300 people. I want you to sign a statement that will allow us to assess a security vulnerability." "Those aren't different things." The overseer made a sound that might have been a sigh if the Verath had lungs configured for sighing. It didn't quite. The sound was close. Another studied approximation. "You are very stubborn," it said. "I know," Leonard said. What the overseer did not know, what Leonard had been careful to keep below the surface, as carefully as a man crossing ice keeps his weight distributed, was that he had already done it. The transmission the overseer was trying to get him to describe had gone out 14 months ago, and the method it had traveled on was not a technical vulnerability that could be found and closed. It was a human one. It was the fact that the Verath, for all their biological and technological sophistication, had not yet figured out how to account for the particular way that human beings encoded information in the things they left behind. Leonard had trained as an electrical engineer before all of this. He had spent 12 years maintaining broadcast infrastructure across 3 states, and he understood, at a cellular level, that a signal didn't have to look like a signal to be one. The Verath monitored electromagnetic transmissions because that was how they communicated. Compressed, efficient, direct. They had spent less time thinking about the other ways information moved. The way it moved through music, for instance. Through the particular sequence of tracks requested by a prisoner in a re-education cell, transmitted to Verath administrators as behavioral data, routed through their own processing systems as nothing more meaningful than evidence of a human's cultural preferences. The requests had seemed random. They were not. And the people on the other end, 3 cells, the northeastern corridor, exactly as the statement said, had understood them, because Leonard had taught them the key before he was taken. In a conversation on a hillside that he had known, even then, might be the last private thing he ever said out loud. The cells were still active. The overseer did not know this. The overseer thought it was trying to discover a technical method. It was actually trying to close a barn door while the horses stood, quiet and patient, in the field on the other side. What Leonard needed now was time. The cells needed another 6 weeks to move their people. He had been told this in the only way he had been told anything since his capture, in the music. The overseer chose the tracks, but it chose them from a library. Leonard had been allowed to curate in the first weeks of his captivity when the Verath were still operating under the assumption that comfort produced cooperation faster than deprivation. He had been careful then to build a library that looked like a man's honest musical preferences, and was also an encoding system. Every 3rd track in every playlist he created was a carrier. The data rode in the sequencing. The overseer's own systems piped it through. He needed 6 weeks. He looked at the document on the table. "Let me think about it," he said. The overseer's head tilted again. A different angle this time. Surprised, Leonard thought, or the Verith equivalent. "That's new. I've been here a long time. You have. I'm tired, I know. Give me a week. I want to think about it honestly." "Can you?" He paused, and let the pause carry the weight of a man who was genuinely, exhaustedly considering surrender. "Can you put on something from the list? The long playlists. Let me sit with it." The overseer studied him for a long moment. The air pressure feeling of being completely, environmentally observed. Then, "Of course," it said, and something in the word carried the specific warmth of a creature that believed it had, finally, begun to win. The music started. Leonard recognized the third track. He closed his eyes and began to count. The cell was 7 meters by 4. He had measured it by walking it in his socks in the early days, when he had still believed the measurement would matter, that knowing the dimensions of the cage was somehow the same as planning to leave it. He had been wrong about that. He'd been right about the socks. The composite floor held cold the way metal did, and keeping the feeling in his feet had turned out to matter more than he'd anticipated. There were cameras, 4 of them, set in the upper corners. Verith optical units that could resolve detail at ranges and light levels that human cameras could not approach. He did not know exactly what they could see. He assumed everything. He operated on that assumption, and had from the beginning, which meant that, whatever he thought while looking at the ceiling, it had to look from the outside, like a man staring at the ceiling. He was good at that. He'd spent his childhood being good at exactly that, holding a placid surface over water that was moving fast. His mother had called it his poker face. She'd taught him to play cards when he was 6, sitting at a kitchen table in a house that smelled like coffee and motor oil, because his father was always working on something in the garage, and the smell came in under the door. She had been a patient teacher. She had not let him win until he could genuinely beat her, which had taken 3 years. He thought about that sometimes, the patience of it, the specificity of love that looked like stubbornness. He thought about it now, staring at the ceiling, keeping his face empty and his mind working. The message in the music had been layered. There were things the cells needed from him beyond silence. They needed confirmation that he had not broken, that the key was still secure. He had been providing that confirmation through the track requests, but the method was slow, constrained by what the overseer would accept as natural listening behavior. 1 track per session with embedded confirmation data. 14 months of that, and the overseer had no idea it was happening. What he needed now was to buy 6 weeks without breaking. The difficulty was his body. The overseer was right that he was tired. He was not performing exhaustion. He was exhausted, genuinely, in a way that went below the muscle and lived in the bones and in the particular heaviness behind his eyes that he could not remember not having. The Verith understood human biology well enough to know how to apply pressure without leaving marks. Not because they were merciful, but because marks complicated administrative paperwork. And the overseers were, above everything else, bureaucratic. The pressure they applied was environmental. The light cycling that didn't quite match a human circadian rhythm. The temperature that hovered just below comfortable. The sounds that were not quite loud enough to be called noise, but were not quite quiet enough for real sleep. It was effective. It was wearing him down in the way that water wore rock. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just the slow, patient removal of material. He had started to dream about Joanna. This worried him more than the exhaustion did. Dreams were the mind's pressure release valve. And if the valve was releasing in the direction of the one thing the overseer had clearly identified as a lever, then the overseer didn't need to be intelligent so much as patient. It just needed to keep applying pressure until Leonard's own subconscious did the work for them. He could not let that happen. He thought about what Joanna had said to him on the hillside 2 days before his capture, which meant she had known, which meant she had been trying to give him something to carry. He hadn't understood it as a gift at the time. She had said the thing about signals is that they have to travel through something. They can't go through nothing. They always leave a mark on whatever they travel through. The medium changes the message a little. That's not a flaw. That's how you know it was real. He had thought she was talking about radio. She had been talking about him. He rolled onto his side and faced the wall and let his shoulders drop in the way that would look, from the camera, like a man trying to sleep. Under the surface he was counting, running the sequence, checking his own encoding, making sure the structure was intact. The cells were still active. The key was still secure. He had not broken. The overseer thought he was considering surrender. He was considering nothing of the sort. What he was considering was a 6-week performance. The most sustained and detailed piece of acting of his life, in which he would play a man, slowly, genuinely coming apart, feeding the overseer the sense of progress it needed, without giving it the thing it actually wanted. He had always been good at holding a placid surface over fast-moving water. His mother had taught him well. The dinner sessions were the hardest. The overseer liked them, or performed liking them. Leonard had stopped trying to determine where Vareth behavioral performance ended, and Vareth internal experience began. Mostly because the distinction seemed academic, and his available mental bandwidth was limited. The overseer brought food and sat across the table and ate something from a container that Leonard tried not to look at directly, and it talked. It liked to talk about what it called the situation, the broader picture, the administrative reality of what the Varath were doing on Earth, and why, laid out in the flat, reasonable, well-organized language of a middle manager explaining a restructuring. You have to understand, it said, during what Leonard had decided to count as the 43rd dinner, though his count might have been off by several either direction, that we did not come here to eradicate. That is a common misapprehension. We came here to stabilize. Leonard moved food around his plate. The food was real. Vegetables, some kind of grain, an approximation of a protein that tasted better than he expected, and that he ate carefully, rationing his reaction to it, not letting himself eat with the relief he felt, because relief was data the overseer would collect. Stabilize, he said. Your species was on a trajectory, you know this. The data were not ambiguous. The overseer's secondary eyes moved to the footage loop on the wall panel. Different today, a forest canopy somewhere, leaves moving in slow wind. We have seen this trajectory before, 6 times on 6 other worlds. The outcome is consistent. And you're here to save us from ourselves. We're here to manage a transition that you were going to force on yourselves anyway. We are simply the mechanism. The mechanism that runs processing centers. The mechanism that maintains order during a period of radical restructuring. The overseer's voice did not change. It never changed. This was perhaps the most alien thing about it. Not the biology, not the 4 eyes, not the gait that was wrong in the way that almost right things were wrong. It was the voice, the absolute architectural evenness of it. Leonard had never heard it rise or fall. Order requires information. Information requires cooperation. Cooperations require them like this one, sometimes. The overseer tilted its head. You are not an unintelligent man, Vasquez. You understand systems. You understand that systems require maintenance. You have spent your professional life maintaining systems. I've spent my professional leaping signals moving. Yes. And signal suppression is a maintenance problem like any other. We suppress yours. You find ways around it. We look for those ways. This is systems maintenance. There is nothing personal in it. There's nothing personal in it for you, Leonard said. For me, it's all personal. The overseer considered this. Picked up its fork. It had been using a fork. With the same careful deliberateness, it applied to everything. Having clearly decided that eating with a fork was the appropriate human accommodations gesture for a dinner session. And put it down again. Tell me about her, it said. Leonard looked at it. He hadn't expected that. After 14 months, the overseer could still surprise him, which meant he had not fully mapped it, which meant he was more vulnerable than he thought. He filed this. You keep going there, the overseer said. In your mind, I can see it happen. You go somewhere warm. It paused. I am not going to use it against you. I want to understand it. Why? Because I have sat across from humans for 4 of your years. I have sat across from 63 of them in rooms like this. I have watched all of them go somewhere in their minds, to something warm, when the room becomes too much. I have watched all of them, eventually, bring the warm thing out where I can see it and use it. And yet they all protect it to the last. Another pause. I want to understand what it is about the warm thing that makes it worth the cost. Leonard was very still. I'm not asking as a tactic, the overseer said. I'm asking because I genuinely don't know. The Vareth do not have it stopped, started again. We don't have something that functions the way that does. Leonard looked at it for a long time. He thought about the hawk. He thought about Joanna pointing at it, look, and about the way she had said it. Not as a command, but as an invitation. As though the seeing itself was something to be shared. As though perception was better doubled. It's not the thing itself, he said finally. It's that someone else is in it with you. The overseer was silent. You can take everything else, Leonard said. You can take the room, and the food, and the sleep, and the name and the boots. But if there's someone who's seen what you've seen, if there's someone who knows the same piece of the world that you know, you're not alone in it. Not completely. He looked down at his plate. That's what you can't take. Not because it's protected, because it's not a thing, it's a fact. Joanna stood on that hill. She saw that hawk, I saw her seeing it. Those are facts. You can't revise facts. The overseer sat with this for a long time. Long enough that the ventilation system cycled twice. When it spoke again, its voice was exactly the same as it always was. And yet, something in the quality of the air had changed. Very slightly, as though the room itself had shifted a fraction of a degree. Sign the statement, it said, and you can go find her. No, Leonard said. Why not? Because if I sign it, she might not be there to find. The 5th week of the performance was the hardest. He had miscalculated, somewhere around the 3rd week, and gone too far into the appearance of collapse. The overseer had brought in a second figure, not another Verith, but a human administrator, a man named Coates, who worked for the Compliance Bureau, and who had the specific hollowness of a person who had decided a long time ago that survival was worth whatever it cost. Coates had sat next to the overseer and smiled at Leonard with a smile that had been emptied of everything that made a smile mean something, and had said, "Just sign it, Leonard. Nobody loses, everybody gets to go home." Leonard had looked at him and thought, this is what they think breaking looks like. This is what they think they've done to you. He had straightened very slightly in his chair. A millimeter, maybe less, but the overseer had seen it. Its secondary eyes had moved, a quick refocusing, and Leonard had known that the performance had cracked. So he had pivoted. He had let the straightening become a flinch, made it look like a reflex, a man who'd been reaching for something, and pulled his hand back at the last moment, afraid of his own impulse toward dignity. And the overseer had read it that way. He was almost certain, but the margin had narrowed. In the 6th week, with 2 weeks still needed, he was down to almost nothing. He was genuinely exhausted. The performance of exhaustion had begun to overlap with the real thing until he could not reliably distinguish them, which was its own kind of danger. A man performing collapse who had begun to actually collapse had very little warning before the performance became true. He lay on the cot in the hours between sessions, and he ran the sequence like a prayer. The cells were still active. The key was still secure. He had not broken. He was not going to break. He thought about his mother at the kitchen table. 3 years before she'd let him win. The patience of it. The love that looked like stubbornness. He thought about Joanna. The thing about signals is that they have to travel through something. They always leave a mark on whatever they travel through. The medium changes the message a little. That's not a flaw. That's how you know it was real. He was the medium. He was what the signal was traveling through. The cells were the signal. And the mark it had left on him, the cost of it, the exhaustion, the slow erosion, that wasn't a flaw. That was how anyone who found him afterward would know it had been real. He held on to that. In the 44th dinner session, or somewhere around there, his count had slipped. He asked the overseer for something he had not asked for before. "Can I see outside?" he said. "Not the footage, actual outside, a window." 5 minutes, the overseer studied him. "Why?" "Because I need to remember what actual air looks like." He paused. "I'll think harder about the statement if I'm not. If I feel less like the walls are." He stopped. Let the stopping carry the weight of a man who could not finish the sentence, because the thing it described was too close and too large. The overseer took a long time. "Tomorrow," it said. The window was a slot 2 feet wide, set at ground level in a corridor that Leonard was escorted through by a single Verith compliance officer. The slot looked out at a concrete exercise yard, and beyond the yard, through a chain-link fence topped with Verith signal wire that buzzed at a frequency Leonard could feel in his back teeth, was a stand of trees. Real trees. The actual green of them, in the flat afternoon light, hit him in a way he hadn't expected and had to control. Rapidly, because the overseer was behind him and his face was visible. And the thing on his face right now needed to be gratitude, not triumph. Because the trees were the right trees. He knew those trees. He had grown up 50 miles from here, and those were the specific trees. The particular mixture of oak and hemlock that grew along the eastern edge of the ridge where the transit corridor ran. And if the transit corridor was there, then the cells were not 300 miles away. They were close. They had moved. And that meant they were not 6 weeks out. They were done. He was the last piece. He looked at the trees for exactly long enough to look like a man who needed to look at trees. And then he turned back. "Okay," he said. He asked for the document at breakfast the next morning. The overseer arrived with it so quickly that Leonard understood it had been ready all along, had been waiting, on a table somewhere, for this moment, and the speed of its arrival told him that the overseer had been under its own form of pressure. Not from Leonard, from elsewhere. From whoever was above it in the Vareth administrative structure, who wanted this particular signal path closed. Which meant the cells had been moving. Which meant the cells had been producing results that the Vareth had noticed without being able to source. Which meant that every week Leonard had held had been a week of something real happening in the world beyond the room. He sat down, he took the document. He read through it carefully, as a man who was genuinely to considering it would read through it, and he noted, as he had noted each time before, that the technical description it required was vague enough to be satisfied by a description of something that was already closed. A transmission method they had burned months ago. A frequency band they no longer used. He could give them what they asked for, and it would mean nothing, because the thing they thought they were closing had already moved on, the way a living thing moves on, the way signals move through whatever medium they find. He picked up the pen. The overseer went very still. The quality of its stillness was different from a human stillness in the way that all its movements were different. Complete, total, as though all four eyes and every external sensory organ had focused to a single point. Leonard wrote his name. He laid the pen down. He slid the document across the table. The overseer picked it up and looked at it. Read the technical description. Read it again. Leonard watched its face. The Vareth face. The one that didn't move the way a human face moved, that expressed through angle and eye movement rather than muscle, and he watched the moment it understood. It was subtle, less than a millimeter of change in the tilt of its primary visual axis. But Leonard had been watching that face across a table for 14 months, and he saw it. This method, the overseer said carefully. You've described a method using frequency band 7 alpha. That's right. We closed that band 11 months ago. I know, Leonard said. I was using it before you did. A long silence. The ventilation cycled. The music, he had not requested anything, but it was playing anyway. Something stringed and minor key. Moved toward a resolution it almost found. The transmission you described was not the active method, the overseer said. No. There is another method. There was, Leonard said. Past tense. The overseer sat with this. Its secondary eyes moved, a quick sweep, a recalibration. You're telling me, it said slowly, that you've been operating a signals network through this facility, through systems we control, for over a year. 14 months, Leonard said. Give or take. Another silence, longer, and it's done, the overseer said. You're telling me because it's done. I'm telling you because you asked. You wanted the method. There it is. I used your music library as a carrier signal and your own administrative data routing as the transmission medium. Your systems moved my signal for me. You were the infrastructure. He looked at it across the table. You wanted to understand what the warm thing was worth. Now you know. It was worth 14 months in this room. It was worth letting you think you were winning. It was worth the cost. He met its four eyes one after another, in the way he'd learned to do over 14 months. Primary first, then secondary, a gesture of directness that the Vareth read as honesty. She stood on a hill with me and looked at a hawk. Those are facts. Everything I did in here was to make sure the people who helped me were safe enough to have their own facts. Their own hills, their own hawks. The overseer was very still. Are you going to hurt me now? Leonard asked. The overseer was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the music almost found its resolution and then didn't. You know, it said finally, what I don't understand about your species, what I have never in 4 years of this been able to model adequately, is not the stubbornness. I understand stubbornness. I don't understand why the stubbornness is always in the service of someone else. Leonard looked at it. 63 humans, the overseer said. Every one of them eventually showed me the warm thing, and every one of them, when I examined what they were protecting, it was not themselves. It was always someone else. It set the document down on the table between them. We have very good predictive models for most behaviors. We do not have a good model for that. No, Leonard said. I don't think you would. They released him at the eastern gate, which was how they always released them. A gate, a corridor, a door, the particular choreography of release that was designed to feel like gift-giving and functioned as a final data point. They watched how you walked out. They watched which direction you turned. They watched whether you ran or walked and whether you looked back. Leonard walked. He did not run. He turned east, which was the direction of nothing in particular, and he did not look back. He walked for 400 meters and turned north, and then northeast, and then he was in the tree line. The real trees, the oak and hemlock of the ridge, and he stopped. He stood in the trees and he breathed. The air was cold and it smelled like actual soil, actual bark. The green vegetable smell of things that were not recycled and not managed and not precisely maintained to a tolerance of 0.5 degrees. He breathed it until his hands stopped shaking, and then he kept breathing it because hands were still shaking. And because he had not told the overseer everything. He had been honest about what was past. He had not told it what was coming, because the last signal, the one he had sent in the 6th week through the track sequencing, had not been a confirmation. It had been a coordinate. The facility's location, encoded in the specific gap between the first and second tracks of a playlist, transmitted through the overseer's own data systems, received by people who were no longer 300 miles away but close, very close, in the tree line of this exact ridge, who had been waiting for him to walk through that gate. A twig snapped to his left. He turned. Joanna stood between two oaks, 8 feet away, in a jacket that had been patched at both elbows and boots that had been resoled at least once, and her hair was different than he remembered. Shorter, practical. The hair of a person who had not had time to think about hair, and her face was the same, exactly the same, except there was something in it that hadn't been there on the hillside. A caution, maybe. The specific acquired wariness of a person who had learned, in the hardest way, that not all good things were permanent. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You're late," she said. "I had a meeting." Her breath came out in a long, shaking exhale that wasn't quite a laugh, and wasn't quite a sob, and was, Leonard thought, exactly the sound of relief. "I know. We were listening." She took a step toward him. "Stopped. Are you?" "I'm fine," he said. It was not entirely true. He was exhausted, and his left hand still had bad circulation, and he was going to be cold for weeks, because the Verith had managed his body temperature for 14 months, and his own thermoregulation was going to need time to recalibrate. He was not fine in any quantifiable sense. "I'm fine," he said again. She crossed the remaining distance and put her arms around him, and he put his around her, and they stood in the trees in the cold air that smelled like actual things, and he felt the solid, specific warmth of her actual, specific weight and warmth, not the memory of them. Not the version of them he had maintained in the room as an act of resistance. And he thought, this is the fact. This is the thing that travels through you and leaves its mark, not a flaw, evidence. "The cells," he said into her shoulder. "All clear, 3 months ago. We've been moving since." She pulled back enough to look at him. The caution in her face had not gone, but something behind it was warm and unguarded, the way it had been on the hillside, looking at the hawk. "You bought us time. I know, they still don't know how." "No," he said. "They have a good model for most things. Not for that." She looked at him for a moment with the suspicious look of someone who wanted to ask what he meant and was deciding whether now was the time. She decided it wasn't. Later. There would be time for it later. Instead, she looked up, through the bare branches of the oaks, at the strip of pale sky above the ridge, and she said, "Look." He looked up. A hawk. He did not know how, could not have explained it, would not have tried, was riding a thermal above the tree line. Just there, suspended in the cold air, absolutely still in its stillness. Everything it needed in the motion of the world beneath it. He watched it. She watched him watching it. The signal had traveled. It had left its mark. It had arrived. Below the ridge, through several kilometers of managed concrete and Verith signal wire and administrative infrastructure, an overseer sat alone at a table, in a room that smelled like recycled air and old fear, and turned a signed document over in its hands. It was trying to build a model. It had been trying to build a model for 4 years. The model was good, it was very good, but there was something in the data, a variable it could not isolate, a factor that appeared again and again across 63 cases and remained, each time, outside the frame of anything it knew how to calculate. It set the document down. On the panel across the room, the footage loop had stopped. The rolling green hills, the footage from a drone over somewhere that had once been called Ireland, had been replaced by a technical error screen. The Verith equivalent of static, clean and geometric, and entirely without warmth. The overseer looked at the static for a long time. It thought, in whatever way the Verith thought things they had not yet found words for, about a hawk on a thermal above a ridge, and a man and a woman standing in the trees below it, and the specific stubbornness of a species that would spend 14 months in a room like this, when not for its own survival but for the survival of people it had never met and would never meet. Because those people mattered to someone who mattered to them, and that mattering propagated outward in every direction, through every medium it could find, and left its mark on everything it traveled through, and could not. The overseer understood this now, clearly and finally and too late, could not be suppressed. Not permanently, not completely, because it was not a signal in any sense the Verith had a receiver for, it was a fact. And you could not revise facts. Outside on the ridge, in the cold air, the hawk turned on the thermal and was gone. Leonard and Joanna walked north into the trees, their footsteps quiet on the frozen ground, putting distance between themselves and the room, heading toward whatever came next, warm in the places that counted, carrying everything that mattered, which was not heavy, which had never been heavy, which had been in the end the only thing they needed to carry. The knowledge that someone else had seen what they had seen, stood where they had stood, looked at what they had looked at. They were not alone in it. That was enough. That had always been enough. That would always be enough.